Well, I got to tease my wife a little bit here to start this message. Connie has been working on a family tree, and she's slowly working her way up her family tree by taking pictures of gravestones. Now, there's a local chain, convenience store chain in Minnesota called Quick Trip. You can go ahead and put that picture up there. There it is, a Quick Trip. So every time we go out to visit these cemeteries to get more pictures for her ancestry, I call it a crypt trip. She's taken a lot of grief about these crypt trips. Let's meander through a cemetery for just a moment. The very first thing you notice in a cemetery is its age, whether the cemetery is new or old. A new cemetery will be well cared for, having a good endowment. Tombstones are probably the kind you mow over, and the trees are still babies. An older cemetery will have larger trees and vertical tombstones, and sometimes a lack of upkeep. Some cemeteries, virtually everybody has died who knows anything about that cemetery, and they're derelict. And tombstones have changed over the years, too. The earliest ones are the white stone, and age has erased much of its writing. Then there are the upright stones, and then finally the new generation of the bronze that are flat you can mow over. Most of these just have a name, a birth date, a date of death, and their life is represented by the dash between those two dates. I have noticed some newer tombstones that are vertical, and they have carvings of RVs or fishing boats or deers. And I even saw one, are you ready for this, that has an LED screen on it, scrolling through to give us a little of the person's life. Now, you can tell the somebodies from the nobodies by their tombstone, by the size and extravagance. Now, today's message is about a nobody who became a somebody because he prayed. Now, this fall, we're going to be doing biblical characters. There's a lot you can learn by looking at somebody's biography. We can learn about their successes and their failures, and these are our spiritual ancestors. Now, today's biography is a little longer than a dash, but it's very short. In fact, it fits into 2 verses. I can say it in 5 words. Jabez prayed, and God blessed. I didn't do that well with my fingers, but you got the idea. This is how it reads in 1 Chronicles. There was a man named Jabez who was more honorable than any of his brothers. His mother named him Jabez because his birth had been so painful. He was the one who prayed to God of Israel, "Oh, that you would bless me and expand my territory. Please be with me in all I do and keep me from all trouble and pain." And God granted him his request. That's it. That's his entire life. Success reveals character. He was more honorable than his brothers. Humility, his name was pain, precedes blessing. Now, most stories start with an ideal situation. There's a crisis, and then the remainder of the story is that character getting back to the ideal state through actions and events. Jabez's story is even simpler. You got the crisis and the blessing. Let's start with a little background. We don't know exactly why his mom named him Pain, but there are 2 options. The first is that his name is actually a pun that means pain, sorrow, anguish. He had some brothers, so this lady knew something about giving birth. If he was the firstborn, there must have been something unusual about it. If he was one of the later born, then obviously there was something abnormal about his birth. Or it could be that her circumstances at that time were very painful. We know that the book of 1 Chronicles was written about the time of the exile, when the exiles were allowed to go back home. So what happened is King Darius, he sent them all home. They got back home, and all their houses were all broken down. What was once vineyards and arable fields were now just torn down. There was wild animals and thorns everywhere. And the Israelites had to build lean-tos, booths to live in. Perhaps if there hadn't been a midwife nearby, she would have died. Perhaps her husband died on the way home, back to Israel. We don't know. How would you like to be named ugly, stupid, bad luck, or painful by your mother? It would stick to you like glue every time somebody's called your name. Hey, ugly! Chances are you'd live up to that name, or at least you would see yourself in that name. There are low expectations for Jabez. The story has an interesting placement in the book of 1 Chronicles. In the book of 1 Chronicles, at this point, the author is going through the ancestry of David, from David to Judah. And he's going along, and then all of a sudden he breaks and comes up with these two verses. It's almost as if the author of 1 Chronicles is walking through a cemetery going, yeah, here's this one, here's this one, here's this one, and he sees this massive tombstone, and then he goes, oh, this is what I'm talking about right here, Jabez. You see, the goal of this chronicling of the ancestry is to show God's blessing on Israel and David. And it's almost like the author says, look at this. Because Jabez was obedient and honored God, God blessed him. And the same will be true of the Israelites who have been through so much in Babylonian captivity. Even though it looks like they're a nobody right now, if you are faithful to God, if you are obedient to God, God will again make you more noble than your brothers. Deuteronomy 28 contains God's hope and covenant for Israel. He wants to bless his people. God wants to bless Israel because he loves them. It brings him pleasure and it brings him glory. God's blessing is conditioned upon is conditional if you obey the Lord your God. I believe that the author of 1 Chronicles is saying, "O Israel, you have returned broken and sorrowful from Babylon. But if you will ask God and obey him, he will again bless you." Just look at Jabez. And then he continues on with the ancestry. Jabez was more noble than any of his brothers. Now that line was written after he lived his life. He overcame the stigma of his name. He ended his days with more honor, higher status, greater influence than any of his brothers. Here's how it happened. He prayed. The simple answer, he prayed, he believed, and lived a life of obedience. Now, prayer is often neglected because it means we really have to believe someone is listening. Otherwise, we're just flapping our lips. But when you pray, you really believe someone is listening to you, somebody who is engaged with you. Now, unlike the Word of Faith preachers, the name it, claim it guys, I don't believe God is going to make us all wealthy. Just think of the parable of the talents. Remember, he gave one talent, one 5 talents, one 10 talents, bags of gold. That reveals that God gives each of us different gifts and capacities. God has different plans for each one of our lives. It may not be what we want. The Bible says many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. In the end, character is more important than wealth or influence. Success reveals character. Humility precedes blessing. Success or wealth could crush someone. Jabez's prayer teaches us it's okay to ask boldly. Jabez prays for 4 things. Blessing. Oh, that you would bless me. He asked for overwhelming blessing, that the humble beginnings of his life and limitations of his name would be forgotten, that his future would be a contrast to his past. Expansion, and expand my territory. This is a gimme list. He's asking for riches and power. Now, this is uncomfortable for us today because Jesus said we're to ask for our daily bread. But it says Jabez was honorable, which means he had good motives for asking. James wrote, when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on pleasures. Obviously, Jabez had good intentions. Empowerment, please be with me in all that I do. What a bold prayer. Be with me in everything. God does have plans and purposes for your life. He works all things out in the conformity with the purpose of His will. God has a wonderful plan for your life if you humble yourself before Him. God lifts up the lowly. Jabez started as a nobody, became a somebody, but he never changed his name. I once was on the phone with a pastor. I really admired him. He has since passed. He is a mega church pastor, an executive presbyter. If I were to tell you his son-in-law, another mega church pastor in the United States. I was on the phone with him one day, and I started stumbling over my words. He asked what was wrong. I said, well, I'm a little bit intimidated talking to you. His response revealed his heart. He got a little weepy. He said, I'm sorry, I must have projected something I shouldn't have. He says, how about we just start our whole relationship over again? And instantly I was talking to a farm kid, not the great pastor I had imagined. Success reveals character. Humility precedes blessing. Again, these prayers make us uncomfortable because it says in the New Testament, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of another. And his final prayer is protection, and keep me from all trouble and pain. This was a prayer to break free from the stigma of his name. He was limited by his name. He wanted to be free from the expectations. Did you start life with few expectations, few opportunities, and a lot of limitations? Look at Jabez's prayer for an example. God answered his prayer, and God granted him his request. God always answers prayer. Many times it's no, sometimes it's maybe, and sometimes it's yes. God is not a big Santa Claus in the sky handing out presents, but He does listen to the cry of His children. Jabez did not become instantly wealthy or famous. He humbled himself before God and lived a life of obedience, and over time, God blessed the work of his hands. It seems like every time I've been blessed in my life, it followed a season of suffering and trial. It's as if God wanted to beat every ounce of pride out of my heart. And at the same time, each trial prepared me for the next step. Jesus told the story about a man who needed food for some unexpected guests. And the man went and pounded on his neighbor's door and said, give me food. And the guy just didn't want to get up and give him food. He was already in bed. Jesus used that story to teach us about prayer. Keep on asking, and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, and you will find. Keep on knocking, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who seeks finds, and to everyone who knocks, the door will be open. What would you want from God? Why does God bless us? Because we're His children. He loves us, it brings Him pleasure, and it brings Him glory. At this time, we're going to have the prayer team and pastors come along the front here. And we're just simply going to have you come and tell God what you want. And then we're going to pray and believe. JP, if you could just start playing something. If I could have the prayer teams and pastors come along the front here. We're going to pray blessings over you. And maybe you're thinking, well, I'm really not a child of God at this point. You're not on speaking terms or whatever. Come on down. We'll help you connect with God. And so please, if you want a blessing in your life, we don't necessarily need to pray the prayer of Jabez over you, but there's something that you want from God. Now is the time to ask, and to ask boldly. You just heard a message on Jabez, who God answered his prayer and God blessed him.